Overnight, snow had fallen thickly again in Croftondale, and now in the morning the fells on the other side of the valley were pure white against the sky. Further down, where the sun had not yet reached, the wood by the beck was steeped in shadow and would stay cold all day. From his study, Richard Willoughby heard a volley of gunfire. Men from Micklebrow, probably, who'd walked over the moor to take advantage of the wide, empty canvas on which grouse and pheasants were as bright as streaks of paint. He watched the rooks burst from the ash trees outside the window, their calls cracking on the frozen air. They reminded him of the paper birds he'd once made in the small hours when Ewan had been frightened and restless. And how, when the birds had been folded into shape, he'd told stories with them, and the boy had eventually gone, his big eyes closing in much-needed sleep. After the funeral, at the end of the previous summer, Richard's tactic, just as it was now, had been to work as hard as he could. Before lectures, he would ensconce himself in the depths of the library and return after he'd finished teaching for the day. Work was all he talked about. Work was all he did. Responsibility for getting him to take some leave had devolved to Stella Wicklow, head of the history department. "Look," she said, "I'm sure Juliet would appreciate you being at home, wouldn't she?" At first that had been true, but not now. Richard could hear Juliet crying softly again in the room above. He was determined to let her, after what she'd said. From the scullery he picked up his Wellingtons, then he closed the front door behind him and went down the driveway, leaving boot prints a foot deep. Across the lane from the house was the field. His field, it was still strange to say. This little plot of land was one of the things that had attracted Juliet to Starve Acre in the first place. As far as she was concerned, there was no better gift they could give their children than a natural playground that grew as they grew. Opening the field gate, Richard waded through the snow and headed for the tent that he'd set up before Christmas. November had brought endless rain. Any ditches he dug had been quickly filled with water, and so one particularly sodden afternoon he'd driven down to Gordon Lamwell, who'd been a friend of his parents', to see if he had anything useful for sale. Although Gordon claimed that he dealt in antiques, his outhouses were crammed with junk. He'd found an army surplus tent bundled together with its poles. Richard had tried to pay him for it, of course, but Gordon had been reluctant to seem as though he were endorsing the project. He was convinced that Richard's father's decline had been caused by him grubbing about in the mud at Starve Acre. "Are you really sure you ought to be digging there?" he said. "I can't see that I've much choice," Richard replied. "It's the only way I'll know if the roots of the Stithwaite oak still exist." "I'd rather you stayed away from that field." "Haunted, is it?" said Richard. Gordon smiled sardonically, changed the subject. "How's Juliet?" he said. "Tell her that she must come and see me." She did. And that had been the start of her obsession with Mrs. Ford and the beacons. Richard dug through the snow and lifted the fly sheet. With pegs and string and a trowel, he marked out the 6x4 rectangle he would excavate. Progress was, as always, slow and methodical. It was difficult to know exactly where the Stithwaite oak had once stood, and Richard had prepared himself for the fact that there might be little or nothing left to find at all. He had worked for an hour when he felt the trowel scrape across something hard. Using his fingers, he removed the mud more carefully and found the rim of a small pelvic bone. As he cleared one part after another, the rest of the skeleton was revealed. It was a rabbit, he thought, or a fox cub. But then, on closer inspection, he knew it was a hare. For the skeleton to be so perfectly preserved, the animal had to have died naturally and lain in the field for some time. If it had been sick and old, then it might well have commandeered some quiet warren in which to lay down and die. Either that or the hare had been interred here deliberately. It was the kind of thing his father might have done in his last manic days at Starve Acre. Richard took off his coat, laid it down and began to pick the bones out of the hole. Each one came away cleanly, and in his hands they felt stronger than they looked, robust enough to be carried home. Just before 1, Richard heard an unfamiliar car coming up the lane, and Juliet's sister, Harry, approached in her tea-coloured Austin, the headlights bright in the gloom. She got out and lifted her suitcase from the boot. With her other hand she opened one of the back doors, and her little Pekingese dog, Cass, jumped down onto the icy gravel and cocked her leg against the tyre. Since Christmas, Juliet had been finding various ways to prevent anyone from visiting. She'd only given in to her older sister on the proviso that she came to Starve Acre without her parents. "All they do is fuss," Juliet said. "It's not helpful." Richard waited until Harry had rung for a 3rd time before letting her in. "So, how is she today?" she said, resigned already to her sister being no better. "She's just getting dressed," said Richard. He found it a pleasure to lie to her. "At this time? You know, she really ought to be up and about much earlier." "Let me bring her down," said Richard. Outside what had been Ewan's room, Richard could hear Juliet's soft breathing. She had evidently cried herself back to sleep, and he stepped in quietly. It was all as Ewan had left it. From a neutral white nursery, Juliet had decorated the gable end with a cartoon of a smiling dragon, and on the ceiling a spiral galaxy spun around the lampshade. Even his bedsheets hadn't been changed. Richard hated coming in here, preferring to communicate with Juliet through the wood of the door, or to leave her alone altogether if she were being as hurtful as she'd been that morning. Having another child wouldn't be a replacement. He hadn't meant that at all. Of course he missed Ewan. How could she think that he didn't? And what did she want to see? His broken heart on a platter? But that wasn't what they'd actually been arguing about. Juliet was simply angry that he'd asked the same question again. "Is this really what you want? For this Mrs. Ford to come?" "More than anything," she replied. "You don't have to be there. In fact, I'd rather you kept away, if you're determined to ruin it for me." "I've already organised with Gordon to take the test," Richard told her. "I'm going to see him tonight." She smiled with quiet assurance. "You won't pass the test. You're too cynical." "What's wrong with wanting some proof?" "This is proof," she said, brandishing her notebook at him. "I'm not mad, Richard, despite what you think." The pages were filled with lists of all the moments of contact she'd had with Ewan since the funeral. Hoping to pick up the faintest traces of him that she believed were still left in his room, she used Richard's portable Sony to make recordings each evening, and had filled the place with mirrors. Since Ewan had gone, she'd spent every night here on a mattress she'd kept from her days at nursing college. They hadn't shared a bed for months now. Kneeling down, Richard put his hand on her shoulder. She stirred and blinked at him, recoiling from his touch. "It's all right," he said. "It's just me." She glanced around the room, looking, as always, for Ewan. "Harry's here," he said. Richard took Harry's case up to the spare bedroom and then went to the study. He searched the shelves for the volume on mammal anatomy that he remembered seeing somewhere. The study was overrun with his father's books. Richard had started trying to catalogue them. It was a tedious process, but it meant that he came across some things that he didn't know his father had owned, like the woodblock prints of the Stuythwaite oak. It was purely by chance that he found them, pressed inside a heavy volume on the Mongol Empire. They were small, early 17th century, he thought. The edges of the prints were torn, meaning that they had probably come from a larger collection, and Richard suspected that there were more sheets loose in the study somewhere. The 4 scenes he had found so far corresponded to the 4 seasons and were a sort of overture of the tree's changing shape and communal usage during the year. In Spring, a young couple courted under the budding branches. In Merry May, children danced in a ring around the trunk. and then in autumn they were back, collecting acorns and firewood. In the last picture, where the tree was a maze of bare branches, a man climbed up a ladder to the bough labelled Old Justice, with a noose in his hand. His coat was still on the desk where he'd left it. Under the desk lamp, Richard picked out the hare's skull and held it in his palm. It was a beautiful object. The brain cavity was intricately terraced and sutured, and both sets of incisors were still intact. What dominated his attention, though, was the eye sockets. They seemed too wide and too deep, as though this were the skull of a large bird. With a pair of tweezers, he began arranging the vertebra inside a cardboard box in order of shape and size. Piece by piece, he rebuilt the hare, just as it appeared in the book, just as he had found it in the field. Though laid out here in the study, it looked so much bigger. In life, it would have been a magnificent animal. Ewan would have been captivated by it. He would often come into the study while Richard was working. He'd sit quietly on his knee and leaf through picture books. This was Ewan, not what other people said of him. He wasn't vicious or cruel. There were reasons for what had happened at school with Susan Druitt. Richard hoped that everyone might see that now and think of Ewan with sympathy, given that he had passed away. But judgments about people tended to become fixed in the village for considerable lengths of time. Ewan had hurt the girl on purpose, and had admitted to holding her fingers in the jamb of the closing door. His attack being so random, so out of character, made it all the harder for Juliet to take. But, as Richard explained to her, Ewan had only been at Holy Cross a few weeks when it happened. Perhaps he'd merely taken out his anxieties about starting school on someone else. And perhaps it was only pent-up frustration boiling over. Ewan had always been a little behind the others, not quite as quick to count numbers or recognise letters, never quite clapping to the beat. But he was only that way because he'd been born early. He'd soon catch up, there would be plenty of time. Children had it in such abundance that they could throw it away and waste it just as they pleased. For them it would simply unfold and unfold. Only it hadn't. Not for Ewan. The wipers carved off thick wedges of snow from the windscreen, and Richard crunched out of the driveway, following Teddy Burnsall's tractor along the lane. In the village, the church doors were open and the lights were on. It was the night the bell ringers practised. The last of them, late and hurrying, waved to Teddy as he headed towards his farm. Everyone in the village had been outraged on his behalf after what Ewan had done to his horse at the spring fair the year before. But the boy had been goaded, and that always exacerbated his difficulties. The Burnsalls' daughters had to take some responsibility. Over the bridge, Richard passed along the main road and out beyond the last streetlight to Gordon's place, which in the dark always seemed much further away. Gordon offered him one of the unmatching chairs by the gas fire, briskly sweeping the velvet cushion free of cat hairs. "The tea shouldn't be too stewed." He took hold of Richard's hands as he sat down and turned them over. The lines on his palms had gone black with soil. "You're still digging, then?" Gordon frowned. "Has anything turned up?" "Not yet," said Richard, thinking better of telling him about the hare's skeleton. "At what stage do you decide that the whole thing's otiose and call it a day?" he said. "Don't you think that the Stithe oak is there?" asked Richard. "I think there's something there," said Gordon. "Yes, you may well smile, but I've seen things." "Seen things? Like what?" Gordon considered the question. "It's hard to put my finger on it exactly, but you certainly couldn't make me go through that gate." Ewan had adored Gordon, and Gordon had been exceptionally protective over him. He'd always seemed determined to direct Ewan's attention away from the field. He'd drive up to the house with books he'd picked up from the second-hand fairs and read to him. Even if the stories were always a little too mature for Ewan to fully understand, it was the way Gordon told them that he enjoyed. People listened when Gordon spoke, especially at the memorial service when he'd recited so passionately the text of Corinthians 15. In those vague, blank weeks that followed the funeral, Juliet had found Gordon a great comfort. He was attentive to her when Richard was at work. But what seemed obvious now was that he had been weighing her up and waiting for the right time to tell her about Mrs. Ford and the Beacons. "How are things at the house?" he asked. "How's Juliet?" Fine," said Richard. "I'd rather we just got it over and done with." "And have the whole farce exposed, eh?" Gordon smiled and put his cup down on the saucer. "Don't be so dismissive, Richard. You might be surprised. An open mind can only help you move forward." "Ewan's dead," said Richard. "Being open-minded isn't going to change that." "I know he is," Gordon replied. "I'm not saying that we can bring him back." "I just don't want Juliet hurt by false promises," said Richard. "Is that all? Or are you worried that we'll let something wicked into your house?" "I told you, Richard," said Gordon with a laugh in his voice. "It's not a séance." "I know it's not." "Then what are you so anxious about? The test?" "Not really. If Juliet passed, shouldn't I?" "Richard, I've already forewarned you that there's no guarantee of that." "But I'm not letting Juliet go through the sitting on her own." "Look," said Gordon, "drink your tea and then we'll go into the bathroom. It won't take long. Russell's quick, medical student." In the bathroom, Russell was washing his hands, a pale, demure lad with thick copper curls. At 19 or 20, he was one of the younger lodgers Gordon had taken in over the years. From the mirrored cabinet, he took down a plastic box and indicated for Richard to sit on the edge of the bath. "Roll up your sleeve," he said. "What exactly does Mrs. Ford look for?" said Richard, turning back his cuff. "I really couldn't tell you," said Gordon. "She just knows it when she sees it, I suppose." He nodded, and Russell peeled off the lid of the box and took out a syringe. Snow was falling again when Richard left, his arm throbbing dully under the dressing that Russell had taped to his skin. The storm had not been forecast at all, and stripped the ash trees of whatever deadwood was still clinging on. It wouldn't have been a surprise if the power were to suddenly cut out. It often happened in the Dale. On one such occasion, in the November of Ewan's first term at school, when the lines had been snapped by a fallen tree along the lane, Richard and Juliet woke to the smell of burning. It was coming from outside their room, and when they stepped onto the landing, trying the light switches, smoke was seeping out under Ewan's door. Richard went in and found the metal waste bin on fire, and Ewan sitting cross-legged in the glow. "Good God, what are you doing?" Juliet said, and snatched him out of harm's way as Richard used the beaker of water by the bed to put out the flames. The pile of old colouring books and comics collapsed, and ash billowed up into his face. "What were you thinking?" he said. "You could have set the whole house on fire." Ewan wouldn't look at him. "Why did you do it, love?" Juliet asked. "You must have known it was dangerous." "I didn't like the dark," said Ewan. "The dark's nothing to be frightened of," she said. "We've told you that." "But it was talking to me," Ewan said. The night before had been so wild that the boy had probably mistaken the sound of the thrashing trees for the voices in his room. In the morning, Richard suggested that he go to the field, if only so that he knew there was nothing there to be afraid of. "You're just happy to let him go off and play, are you?" said Juliet, "after what's happened?" "I'll keep an eye on him from the study," Richard said. "He'll be fine." As he sat at his desk and typed, Richard watched the boy gathering up the debris from the storm. He began to make a pile of dead wood in the middle of the field, and what looked alarmingly like a bonfire at first turned out to be a sort of castle. The construction kept him busy for some time and became interwoven with a game in which the large branch he straddled was transformed into a majestic horse. While this game persisted, Richard could put him in the peripheries of his sight as he worked, knowing that he would not stray far. It was only when the motion of the little figure suddenly stopped that Richard turned his attention fully to the window. Ewan was standing very still by the pile of branches he'd made, gazing up into the sky. Richard followed his line of sight, but couldn't see any birds or aeroplanes, the kinds of things that the boy often pointed out. Still staring, Ewan dropped the foliage he was carrying, backed away, and then ran up the field towards the house. The snowstorm lasted for most of the night. In the morning, Juliet appeared in the kitchen in a black turtleneck and the jeans she wore day in, day out. Harry left her cigarette in the ashtray and got up to hug her. "You look thinner," she said as the dog who'd been removed from her knee pined for attention. "What did you bring that thing for?" said Juliet. "They'd all ignore you at home, wouldn't they, poor Cass?" Harry scooped the animal into her arms and sat down again. "Jules, I thought we'd go out today." "Go out where?" said Richard. "Down to the village. You could do with some groceries." "I can't," said Juliet. "I need to clean for when Mrs. Ford comes. She said that I had to." "Then you're still determined to welcome these head cases into your house?" Harriet docked her cigarette. "Ouija boards and table tapping." "That's not what the beacons do," Juliet replied. "The beacons?" said Harry. "Jesus!" "He's still here in the house, Harry," Juliet said. "Oh, Jules, come on," said Harry. "Whatever you think you've seen or heard, it's not real. Ewan's dead, love." Juliet began to cry, and Harry embraced her, looking at Richard as if to excuse him from the table. With the winter approaching, the boy had spent less time in the field and more time in the house, and each time he'd been out since, he'd only gone as far as the gate before running home. "What's wrong?" Richard asked him. "Don't you enjoy going to the field any more?" Ewan shrugged. "I don't like the tree," he said. "The trees in the wood, you mean?" "No, the big tree." Now Richard knew why the boy had been staring up into the sky. He'd been picturing the old oak. No doubt Gordon had filled his head with stories. "But there is no tree in the field," said Richard. "Not any more." "It's there sometimes," said Ewan, the logic completely sound to him. "Sometimes it's not." Juliet spent most of the time fretting over Ewan, whose moods had been impossible to keep up with. He'd been morose and then hyperactive, wanting company one minute and to be alone the next. After putting him to bed and getting into the bath, she might surface from the water to find him watching from the doorway. Or he would get into bed with them, and under the sheets he'd pinch their skin or pull Juliet's hair, simply because it hurt, it seemed. "It's all for attention," Richard said, "nothing else." As far as he could see, Ewan was as needful of his parents as any other child. "Do you like him?" Juliet asked. "As a person, I mean." "Of course," said Richard. "Why? Don't you?" "I don't know," she said. "Genuinely, I can't say." "He's still our Ewan," said Richard. And she looked at him as though that were the problem. He was whatever they had made him. If they didn't like what they saw, then it was their own fault. It seemed to Richard sometimes that Juliet had actually brought twins into the world, Ewan and Guilt. The latter had always been the stronger of the two. It fed more, weighed more, demanded more of their attention. When it had outlived Ewan, it had grown larger still. Even before she fell pregnant, Juliet had talked about her boy, her Ewan, describing in detail the personality he would have and the clothes he'd wear. And while Richard always thought it nothing more than a rather sweet exercise of the imagination, the feeling among friends and family had been that Juliet was in danger of jinxing herself and the child in some way. When she was pregnant, it was easy to dismiss it all as superstition. But then Ewan had been born early, and when they tried for a second baby a year later, nothing happened. Then the thought that she had been presumptuous and had inflicted some damage on herself was hard to shake off. When Ewan passed away, she was convinced that it had been her who had invited death to the house. But whether it had been punishment or simply harsh biological fate, it didn't much matter in the end. No conclusions seemed to make sense. No one could explain what Ewan's life was supposed to have meant. He'd gone before he could really become anything, or achieve anything, or make anything. It seemed that he'd only come into the world to take all their love and then fill them with sorrow. As Juliet swept the landing outside the study, Richard resumed the work of unpacking his father's boxes. An hour passed. He sorted what he could into subject groups and added the rest to the ever-growing piles under the window. At the bottom of one box, he found a book full of dried wildflowers from the garden, and folded in the middle was another of the woodblock prints. It appeared to show 3 farmers, one with a cudgel, one with a net. The last, holding a lantern on a pole, knelt in his field saying, "Jack Grey, our bonny sons died for thee." Richard hadn't heard that name since his childhood, when the boys in the village shop would try to scare him. "You know Jack Grey lives in the wood by your field, don't you, Willoughby? You know that he comes out at night and looks through your windows?" The older people in Stithwaite had their stories too, about being followed through Crofton Wood as children, about their grandfathers warning them to look out for Jack Grey, the whistler in the woods, the stranger on the lane at dusk. He would have been an ancient thing of folklore even when these prints were being made. It was hard to imagine that anyone had honestly thought him real. Just after 6 on Sunday evening, Gordon arrived with the beacons. He introduced the well-dressed young man, helping Mrs. Ford up the steps. "This is Peter," he said, and there were firm handshakes. "And Juliet, Richard," said Gordon. "This is Mrs. Ford." Richard had been expecting someone more obviously peculiar, but if he'd passed her in the street, he'd have thought her a primary school teacher or a vicar's wife. "You have a beautiful house," she said, her voice kind but brisk. "I should think your boy was very happy here, wasn't he?" Juliet nodded. "No, no more tears," said Mrs. Ford. "Make this the last time." In the kitchen she invited Juliet to sit at the table. "It won't hurt you what we do tonight," she said. "If you feel changed afterwards, then it will only be in a good way." "But will Ewan come back?" asked Juliet, causing Mrs. Ford to frown. "Ewan Willoughby was just a body. A body can't come back once it's been put in the ground, can it?" "The light was just passing through him," said Peter. "But there are some people," said Mrs. Ford, "who can draw the light back to where it once flourished. You can invite it into a new form." Juliet caught the noise Richard made and glared at him across the table. "And what about Richard?" she said. "Will he be joining us?" "Of course he can stay," said Mrs. Ford. "The reading was very strong, very positive." Richard was surprised. Mrs. Ford could have easily ostracised him with her ridiculous hemomancy, but she hadn't. "Shall we begin?" she said. Peter arranged 2 large jars on the table. Inside one was a mound of grubby melted wax. Inside the other, a brand new white candle. Tipping the first jar, Peter lit the wick and watched it catch and flare. Gordon switched off the lights. They all held hands and a circle formed. "Think of the candle flame," Mrs. Ford said. "Keep that image in your mind, and the light that was in Ewan will come back to you." After some time, the candle burned low, and beyond the table the room was entirely dark. "Where did he like to play?" said Mrs. Ford. "Where was his favourite place?" "His room," said Juliet. No, somewhere else. Not in the house." "What about the field?" Juliet rejected the idea. He didn't always like going there. It frightened him sometimes. "He can't be frightened any more," said Mrs. Ford. "That isn't possible. Tell him he can go. Tell him he can go into the field for as long as he likes." Juliet did so, her eyes red with tears. Richard felt Mrs. Ford's hand tightening on his. Soon a smile spread across her face, and the others grinned too. "Do you see it?" "Yes, I see it." "It's beautiful." "Wonderful." But it all skipped Richard, and he sensed nothing but the sweatiness of Peter's hand and Mrs. Ford's wedding ring digging into his palm. "Look, look," she said. They all watched the flame in the jar shiver and distend until it went out in scrolls of grey smoke. The darkness in the room fell in on them. A few seconds later, the new candles sprang into life. Mrs. Ford broke the circle and Peter passed her a handkerchief to wipe her brow. "Leave the candle to burn," she said. "Don't blow it out. Let it diminish on its own." Juliet looked baffled, as if she were coming round from a dose of anaesthetic. "Give her a moment," said Mrs. Ford. "Come into the hall." "You'll find Juliet much happier from now on," said Gordon as Richard followed him out. "You won't recognise her." Peter held Mrs. Ford's coat ready for her to put on, but she walked away from him to the foot of the stairs and looked up into the dark. "What is it?" said Gordon. She gripped the banister and went up a few steps to peer at the railings on the landing. When she came back down, her legs seemed weak. Gordon quickly moved the stool from under the telephone table for her to sit on. No, she said, turning away from the stairs. "I'd rather we just left. Please, I need some air." As she passed him, Richard could see that her lips had turned pale, and she had the grey cheeks of someone about to be sick. "I'm sorry, Richard," said Gordon. "She does get like this sometimes. Tell Juliet I'll come and see her in a day or so, all right?" It was an effective piece of drama, Richard thought, for Mrs. Ford to leave them in no doubt of her mysticism. Richard left Juliet in the kitchen and went up to the study. He removed the hair from the box and could see straight away that some alteration had taken place to the skeleton. The vertebrae were now connected by little pads of cartilage, and webs of sinew held each bone in place. He tried to recall if some of the joints had been coupled in this way when he'd lifted the remains from the field, but he was certain that he would have noticed. Gripping one of the shin bones, he pulled gently until the leg was extended. The knee held firm, and the ball at the top of the femur was locked tight in the cup of the pelvis. The candle that the beacons had left burned through the night and was still alight the following morning, and as Juliet went about with a beatific smile, the hair continued to change. When Richard looked inside the box, he now found each piece of the backbone was cushioned by plum-coloured discs. He saw too that something string-like, as thin as cotton, had started to thread its way through the vertebra, and at the rear of the skull cavity grew a grey polyp that seemed to be crimped and folded into a tiny brain. The next morning Richard found the hare's skull strapped with the taut cords that swivelled the eyes and moved the jaw. The hind quarters were packed with heavy fillets of muscle that were cold and moist to the touch. At the next inspection, skin had started to form on the back legs. In the evening, the hare wore a pale jacket that, bald and wrinkled, gave it the look of a creature just born. By midnight, the peach fuzz had thickened to a rich pelt, the colour of dry earth. Richard spent a restless night on the sofa by the bookshelves, and when he came out of the study in the morning, he found that Juliet had left his portable recorder by the door, along with the tapes she'd made. All that day she moved about the house with purpose, tidying the front room or cleaning in the kitchen. Distrustful at the sudden change, Harry questioned Richard about what the beacons had said and done, but he had no idea what to tell her. In any case, he didn't think that the difference in Juliet was anything to do with Mrs. Ford, but the presence of the hare. 4 days later, Richard found the box empty on the floor of the study. As he closed the door behind him, the hair emerged from under the desk, as large and lithe as a cat, its wet eyes fixed on his. Richard felt his pulse quickening. With quiet, gradual movements, he crouched down. Dipping its head but keeping Richard in its gaze, the hair nibbled at some ancient crumbs on the floor. It was famished. Of course it was. Outside, the first true warmth of the year was starting to melt the snow in the front garden. The hare gazed through the window, its eyes following every movement of the world outside. Richard knew that to keep it locked up in the study would be cruel. In the shed he found some fruit boxes. 2 of them sandwiched together would keep the hare contained while he removed it from the house, but it would have to wait until dusk. To take it back to the field in broad daylight would make it easy prey for a fox or the rooks. Over the fells the moon was pale. In the field near the tent, Richard stopped and set the crates down. The hare sensed its freedom now and clawed hard at the wood. As soon as there was a gap, it nosed its way out and headed for the first clear line of sight it could find, which was back towards the house. Before it could get too far, Richard clapped his hands, and the hare turned around and sprinted off towards Crofton Wood, opening its long, lean body into full flight. Richard watched it for as long as he could before it disappeared into the trees. When he came back to the house, the door to Ewan's room was propped open with one of his larger teddy bears, and Juliet was taking down the old boxes of jigsaws from the top of the dresser. "They're always looking for donations at the church," she said, and went back to what she was doing. "I'll start on the toys, shall I?" said Richard, and knelt down by the window to collect up the litter of dice and playing cards, conkers and dominoes. Over the course of the evening they removed the mattress Juliet had been sleeping on and took all the mirrors back to the rooms where they belonged. Gloves were reunited, little woolly hats dusted off. Soon there were boxes lined up against the wall, books, teddy bears, games, cars, which they carried down to the scullery. By midnight Ewan's room had been emptied but for the rocking chair and the little wooden bed. All that was left to do was remove the name glued to the door, and Richard prized off the E, W, A and N with a screwdriver. "There is some white paint left in the shed, isn't there, Richard?" said Juliet. "I think so, yes," he replied. "I'd like it all white," she said, "like it used to be." "Fine. We could get it done tomorrow," said Juliet, and switched off the light. "I want it to look like a nursery." Richard imagined her pregnant again, all breasts and belly, carrying a girl this time, the seed of the family proper. Death came, but it went again. There was no reason why they couldn't make Starve Acre the centre of Willoughby life just as they'd always planned. Richard felt the past receding like a tide. The hare had brought the spring. The worst of their grief was over. Perhaps they had survived. The spring was coming. Richard continued to work in the tent, digging carefully with the edge of the trowel. One evening at the 3rd or 4th pass, the blade bit down and chipped off a sliver of something hard. Smoothing off the mud with his thumb, Richard saw that it was a small piece of wood, and gouging in the hole with his fingers, he felt a length of root just under the surface of the soil. For the next hour he raked away at the earth, scraping off the filth with his hands. The root ran diagonally through the rectangle, discoloured by the blackness of mud and time. Whether it had belonged to the Stithwaite oak was impossible to tell. A sample of what he'd exposed would have to be taken for dating to be absolutely sure. He felt that he should contact Stella at the university. This was her area of expertise. He sat for a while looking at the root, planning where he would dig next. In the morning, Juliet was up before he was, and he found her talking to Harry in what he supposed he now ought to call the nursery again. "We ought to move the cot back in here," Juliet said. I could give it a coat of paint once the walls are done. Richard agreed. Are you sure? Said Harry. After all the work you put into it. I don't care, said Juliet. I want everything gone. I'll go and fetch the brushes, Harry said, and went downstairs. Juliet put her hands on Richard's waist and reached up to kiss his mouth. It was the first intimate touch she'd given him since Ewan died. In the study, Richard wound a sheet of paper into the typewriter and began a letter to Stella. He chose his words carefully, outlining what he'd found in the field, though making no mention of the hare. Eventually he got up from the desk and searched for a set of large-scale geological maps he remembered his father owning. If the university allowed him back, he'd be teaching the course on Neolithic Britain in the summer term, and the maps would be useful. After scouring the shelves, Richard looked through the stacks of random books by the window, and in shaking out the contents of a large envelope, he discovered another of the woodblock prints. The scene this time was of a hanging day. 3 men dangled from the bough. Here was Roderick Sales. He burned the hay. Next to him, an Edmund Calvert, who bespoiled a corpse. The last, suspended closest to the trunk, was Will Beeston, ecstasy his master. He was shown at the top of the church tower saying, "See how this angel flies," as he threw a child from the parapet. The dead men, bound at the wrists, their heads yanked aside sharply in the nooses, were boys, really. The bonny sons of the 3 farmers in the previous engraving. Collecting his camera equipment, Richard closed the door and went down the lane. He heard Gordon's van approaching and waited for him to pull in. "Richard," Gordon wound down the window. "You look industrious," he said. "I've found some of the roots," said Richard. "You're not serious. And they belong to the oak, do they?" "As far as I can tell. What's wrong?" Gordon was looking at the house. "Look, I know you'll scoff," he said, "but I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if I didn't tell you what Mrs. Ford told me." "Which was what?" Gordon seemed to be groping for words. "She sensed something in the house," he said eventually. "Something unpleasant." "Unpleasant?" said Richard. "Fetid was the word she used." "Is this a trick?" said Richard. "So Juliet will have to invite her back to cleanse the house or something?" Gordon looked at him squarely. "Stay away from the field, Richard. I know you think I'm being ridiculous, but Ewan spent a lot of time there, and you can't deny that the boy changed." He backed out onto the lane without saying anything more. Yes, thought Richard, he remembered all that clearly enough. He didn't need to be reminded about it by Gordon, especially since it was his stories that had disturbed the boy's sleep. Richard was putting him to bed one night when Ewan wrapped his arms around his neck, squeezing until it became uncomfortable. "Will it be noisy in the field tonight?" he said. "Why would it be noisy?" Ewan let go. "Jack Gray says my name sometimes. He tells me to come to the tree." "Jack Gray," said Richard. "Where did you hear about him? From Gordon?" Ewan nodded. "And what does he say, this Jack Gray?" asked Richard. "To do things." "Like what?" "He said to hurt Susan." Richard sat down on the bed. "Ewan, you know Jack Gray isn't real," he said. "I reckon you're just dreaming about him." "I'm not, Daddy. I'm always awake when he talks." "Listen," said Richard. "You go to sleep, and when you wake up in the morning, all those things that you've been afraid of won't be there anymore." He kissed Ewan on the forehead. "I promise." Richard walked down the field to the tent. He set up the tripod and took a dozen photographs of the roots from various angles. Since he'd come across the print of the hanging, the 3 bonny sons hadn't been far from his thoughts. Their crimes would have devastated the village. The evidence of that lay partly in the fact that there were no Sales, Calverts or Beestons left in Stuythwaite. Either the families had been hounded out after the hangings, or they'd left of their own accord. It was Will Beeston's crime that Richard had contemplated most often. The wood engraver had captured in his face an unmistakable look of joy as he flung the child from the top of the church tower. It may have been a temporary madness, that was possible. There were berries and plants that grew in the dale even now that could cuff the mind sideways. If not that, if it had been planned, then perhaps the 3 bonny sons had made a pact and set out to deliberately torment the village for some reason. It was no wonder then that the boys' fathers had looked to blame it all on Jack Gray. To make the inciter of these offences some fictional sprite of the woods was easier than trying to understand why these lads had suddenly fallen into sin. There was nothing more remote than another person's mind. A father had no more chance of truly knowing his son than he had of knowing a stranger. That had been proved to Richard on the day of the spring fair. Up until then, things had been relatively peaceful for a few months. Ewan had had no other visitations from Jack Gray. Each school day passed without incident, though Ewan said so little that it was difficult to know what he was thinking. Since the episode with Susan Druitt, folk in the village hadn't blanked the Willoughbys as such. There was only indifference, which was worse in a way. On the day of the spring fair they were treated as those from Micklebrow or Lastingley or Skipton were treated, as visitors. It was only the 3 Burnsall girls who went out of their way to upset the Willoughbys by picking other boys over Ewan as he waited for a turn to ride their pony. Richard and Juliet saw that Ewan was getting frustrated and suggested that he choose something else to do. He complied with less fuss than Richard expected, and they went hand in hand to the stall where Audrey Cannon was selling bottles of pop. For the rest of the afternoon they kept him busy, spinning him on the roundabout, pushing him on the swings, trying to ignore the looks from other parents. Juliet was determined to show everyone that she was a good, loving mother of a son who could be loved. The fair always culminated in a game of cricket between those who lived in the village and those who lived on the farms. The Willoughbys living in neither sat at the boundary line with the ones too young or too old to play. Ewan saw that his classmates were kicking a football about by the sycamore trees, and he lay on his belly watching them trying to score between the 2 bicycles they'd let fall into the grass. "Why don't you go and join in?" said Richard. "Can I?" said Ewan. "Of course." Juliet looked uncomfortable with the idea, but to Richard it seemed like a good opportunity for Ewan to make amends for what had happened with Susan Druitt. "Go on," he said. "Go and share your lemonade with them." Ewan got up and went over to the girls first, offering the bottle. There was a cautious pause, and then Susan took it and swigged and passed it around to the others. The football skipped past Ewan's legs, and he went after it as the other boys called for him to shoot. Reconciliation was easy for children of that age, Richard thought. They didn't harbour resentment for long. Anger, jealousy and trepidation were fleeting emotions. It was only as they got older that they turned vindictive. Like the Burnsall girls who'd come over with the sole intention of taunting Ewan again. Holding the football under his arm, he watched them closely, absorbing the names they called him as they pulled the pony along by its bridle. Sticks and stones, Juliet had taught him. Turn the other cheek. Ewan stared as they went away laughing, but was soon distracted when the football was knocked out of his arms and the game resumed. Richard lay back. Juliet rested her head on his shoulder. He shut his eyes against the sunlight. The wood pigeons and the sycamores, the warmth of the breeze and the smell of the grass faded as he balanced on the verge of sleep. They didn't notice that Ewan had disappeared until one of the Burnsall girls came running from the wall of the churchyard, calling for her father. Teddy Burnsall was at the crease, and, distracted, he let the ball clatter into the stumps. It became obvious that something was wrong. He followed his daughter over to where the pony had been tied to a tree. Richard and Juliet ran over, parting the crowd that had gathered. "What's wrong?" said Juliet, putting herself between Ewan and the eldest Burnsall girl, Deborah. "He wants locking up," she said. "He's not right in the head." Ewan squatted down in the grass, scraped at the soil with the end of a stick, impervious to the cries of distress. Behind him, Teddy and Olive Burnsall were trying to calm the pony. Its legs shivered and it shook its bowed head as if it were trying to dislodge flies from its nose. Taking hold of its reins, they managed to turn the animal and lift its chin to see what had happened. One eye stared at the people standing around. The other had been stabbed to glue. Ewan hadn't been able to settle that night. Whenever he was on the brink of sleep, he'd snap awake and start to cry. Juliet listened for a while and then rolled over, leaving Richard to see to him. Curled on his bed, Ewan had his hands over his ears, and it had taken Richard some time to get him to let go. "What is it you can hear?" he said, holding the boy's head to his chest. "Jack Gray," said Ewan quietly. "He's come back, has he?" "He was there at the fair." "Was he? I didn't see him." "You can't see him," said Ewan. "He talks, that's all." "What's he saying now?" Richard asked. "He's not saying anything." "No?" "No," said Ewan. "Now it's like this." He made a strangled sound in his throat. Coming in through the front door, Richard was about to go up to the study when Harry collared him. "Oh, Richard, you tell her," she said, trying to stop the dog under her arm from barking. "She won't listen to me." He followed her into the kitchen where Juliet was sitting on a chair by the wood stove. On her lap was the hare. It lay still while she stroked it from head to haunches, drawing its ears through her fist. The dog's presence didn't appear to faze it at all. "Where did you find it?" said Richard. "You were in the garden, weren't you?" Juliet said, nuzzling the hare's fur. It closed its eyes in contentment. "He's hungry," Juliet said. "Is there anything we can give him to eat?" "Don't feed it," said Harry. "Otherwise you'll never get rid of it." "Harry's right," said Richard. "Better let it fend for itself. Do you want me to take it outside?" Juliet put a protective hand on the hare's back. "No, let me, I'll do it." The hare scrabbled as Juliet carried it out through the door. By the cherry tree, she seemed to be talking to it. Eventually she crouched and sent it away into the undergrowth. Cass barked at the back door until she was certain that the hare had gone. Richard heard the dog again early that evening, yelping and whining. Then Harry crying out for help. Richard found her kneeling on the floor of her room, stroking Cass's twitching body. Blood had been thrown everywhere, against the walls, the rug, the bed. "My God, what happened?" said Richard. "The hare was in here," said Harry, holding together what was left of the little dog. "I tried to chase it off." Her hands were scratched and bleeding too. "I'm going to call Mum and Dad," she said. "Dad will wring that animal's neck." Richard found Juliet in the nursery, wiping the blood off the hare's claws and snout. "That thing ripped Cass to pieces," he said. "Well, the dog must have provoked him," said Juliet. The hare examined him with its unblinking eyes. "You have to let it go," said Richard. "Let him go? We invited him to the house, Richard," she said. "He's here because we wanted him to be." She stroked the hare's back and ears. Then she laid it in the cot. Seeing Richard watching her, she closed the door and locked it. Richard decided that he would try to unearth the final third of the dig and photograph what was there. The hole was deep enough for him to crouch in now, and he could scrape away at the remaining soil with more control. There was no profit in rushing things. One particular stem widened the more he scooped away. As he carved off the dirt, it became clear that this was not one of the roots. It was covered in bark. He smoothed his hand along its length. It was a hulk of a thing, like the trunk of a mammoth. His fingers found deep grooves scored into it that looked like rope marks. Unless another giant gallows tree had grown and died since the Stithwaite oak stood here, then this had to be the hanging bough, Old Justice. On his way home, Richard watched Gordon coming along the street in his van. He flashed his lights and stopped. "Let me talk to you," Gordon said. He held the passenger door open, and after hesitating for a moment, Richard climbed in and sat next to him. "I know you found something in the field," said Gordon. He held up his hand. "I don't want to argue, I want you to listen to me. Forgive me, Richard, but if you can't see that Ewan was affected by something in that field, then you're more deluded than anyone." "It was make-believe," Richard said, "from the stories you told him about Jack Gray." "I only told him about Jack Gray so that he had a name for what he'd seen or heard. I don't know what's there, Richard, not entirely, no one does." "It's nonsense, Gordon, like all that drivel the Beacons came out with." "Come on," said Richard. "If there were anything in it, I'd have seen what the rest of you saw when Mrs. Ford came to the house. I passed her test, didn't I? She found whatever she needed to find in my blood." Gordon turned away from him and looked down the street. He'd rigged it. "For Christ's sake," said Richard, "why?" "Insurance," said Gordon. "None of us wanted you to sabotage the meeting. It was too important." "For who?" "For Juliet, of course." Gordon turned to face him square on. "The guilt was killing her." He paused, then said, "She was with Ewan when he died, Richard. She let him go." Richard went to get out, but Gordon held his wrist tight. "It was for your sake. You don't know how close she came to dying." "What are you talking about?" "Juliet told me that she woke one night a few days before Ewan died and saw him standing next to you with a handful of pebbles from the beck," said Gordon. "You were fast asleep. You had your mouth open." "It would have been a prank," said Richard. "He was only 5. "But if Juliet hadn't woken up?" "Then what? Even if he tipped the lot in, I'd have spat them out." Gordon looked at him. No, Richard," he said. "Ewan had wet the stones so that they'd slip down your throat. You would have choked to death." Richard hung his coat on the rack in the hall. "Mum and Dad are on their way," said Harry. "I'm going to collect them from the station." She was already out of the door and fishing her keys from her pocket. When he went into the kitchen, Juliet was slicing a sandwich of meat and pickles. "It feels like I can't film myself today," she said. "I'm hungry all the time." There was colour in her face. Her eyes were brighter. Richard sat down opposite her. "It's good to see you eating again," he said. Juliet offered her hand. "I'm sorry, Richard," she said. "I know I've been difficult to live with. It was only because I didn't understand what was happening. I'm better now." She let go of his hand, took another bite of her sandwich. "Perhaps I was confused before the Beacons came, but now everything's clear." "You do know that it was a set-up, don't you?" said Richard. "Gordon persuaded Mrs. Ford to let me stay." "It doesn't matter." Juliet smiled. "I'd give anything for you to feel at peace, Richard. When I think of all those months I wasted blaming myself for what I did," she went on. "For what you did?" "Ewan," she said. "I was with him when he was dying. I didn't stop it." Richard held her hand again. "What happened to Ewan wasn't your fault," he said. "You mustn't feel guilty." "But that's just it," she said. "I don't feel guilty anymore. I know that the light left him for a reason." "What are you talking about?" "Because he was so unhappy. Because he would have carried on hurting people," she said. "Richard, there's such an intelligence to everything that happens. I wish you could see it." "There wasn't any reason why Ewan died when he did," said Richard. "The doctor said so, don't you remember?" She was smiling at him. "We've got another chance to love, Richard. A child, Juliet, not that animal." But we called him and he chose to come. That's wonderful, isn't it? She touched his hair, kissed him, and went out. He watched her go and soon heard the pipes of the house pink and rattle when she ran the bath taps. Despite what Juliet said, it was clear that she still felt culpable for the boy's death, but Ewan's heart had been imperfect from birth. 2 doctors had told them that. The defect could have made itself apparent at any time, they said. He might have been taking his first steps or queuing for his pension. There was no telling. Which meant there was nothing that Richard or Juliet could have done differently. At the time, it had been no comfort to hear, but it had the benefit of being true. It could be demonstrated with diagrams. There were books that explained a defective heart in great detail. Juliet could still be reasoned with. In the study, Richard searched for them, peeling off the tape from the last of the cardboard boxes. He took out books on the Iberian lynx, amino acids and fenland irrigation. Between them was a small leather folder, and inside the remaining woodblock prints had been sewn together with string. Richard took the book over to the desk and switched on the lamp. Here were the 3 boys, the Bonny sons being apprehended by the parish mob. Here they were shackled in a cell. Over the page, a courtroom, the justice in his chair, compelling the defendants to disclose all facts before God. Next, the village made instruments of persuasion, the blacksmith's tongs, the ploughman's whip. They had been productive, it seemed, for confessions quickly followed. 'Twas Jack Gray cast his eye upon us. He bid us do much cruelty, sir. And where didst thou meet him? Asked the justice. The artist had described the answer that came. Here were the 3 boys, standing in the field by moonlight. Here were the 3 boys on their knees, bowing down to the creature coming out of the wood. A large, bright-eyed hare. The last few pages of the book were brittle and brown with age. Here were the villagers congregated around the tree in gladness of a devilment ended. From the bough the rope hung long and tight, and at its end the hare sagged in the throttle. Now here was the hangman burying the animal beside the corpses of the 3 boys. Here was the forester, with his saw in his hand, watching the villagers dumping old Justice into the same grave pit. Outside, Richard heard the Austin pulling into the driveway. The hallway became loud with talk as Harry, Eileen and Doug came in. Leaving the prints on his desk, he went to the nursery to warn Juliet that her parents had arrived. He found her in her dressing gown, still damp from the bath. She invited him in and went back to watching the hare as it started to twitch itself awake under the blankets in the cot. A nightlight held the room in a soft blue glow. A clock ticked. Richard started to speak, but Juliet hushed him and leaned over the bars to pick up the hare. Its long body dangled and she folded in its wheeling back legs until it rested against her chest. She had been right. The hare wanted to be here. It had always wanted to be here. When he'd taken it out to the field, it had tried to get back to Starve Acre and find Juliet. It had only run into the wood because he'd forced it that way. Eileen was running up the stairs now, yelling for Juliet. Doug followed her, shouting louder, but there was no anger in their voices, only a strain of fear that Richard knew well. It was the unique dread of every mother and father, the persistent sense that their children had always been drifting away from them, out of reach and beyond their help, into their own deranged worlds. Sitting in the rocking chair, Juliet stroked the animal's ears. When it was settled, she undid the belt of her dressing gown, working her shoulder free and cupping her breast, which had grown engorged and milky white. She offered the nipple to the hare, and, with a paw resting on her sternum, it latched tight and drank.
Starve Acre by Andrew Michael Hurley was read by Brian Dick, abridged by Sean Preece and produced by Ailey Macready. Next week we've an award-winning novel set one summer on the Northern Irish border during the Troubles in the early 1980s, where, while digging illegally for peat with his uncle, Fergus finds the body of a child who seems to have been murdered. He tries to concentrate on revising for his A-levels as a means of escape from the insane world around him. His brother on hunger strike in prison, his growing feelings for Cora, his parents arguing over the Troubles, and being blackmailed into acting as a courier for the IRA. Then a voice comes to him in his dreams, and the story of the Bog Child unfurls. Bog Child by Siobhan Dowd will be read by Finian Garbett next week at the same time.
This is
BBC Radio 4
Extra.
On this week's Great Lives, the poet, editor and artist Michael Horowitz will talk to Matthew Paris about his fellow poet and writer Allen Ginsberg, famous as a core member of the Beat generation. To discuss his colourful and often controversial career and how it inspired American counterculture, the pair are joined by Ginsberg's biographer and friend, Barry Miles.
So here he was, this very insecure teenager, and he had this tremendous desire to save everybody, to save the planet in a sense. And so he went to New York originally to study as a labour lawyer. I mean, he was going to save the workers by battling directly against the capitalist bosses. So he went through a lot of changes, of course. As soon as he got to Columbia and to New York, and he fell in with this with a fast crowd.
The Beat generation.
The Beat generation.
Now, please, somebody define for me, what was the Beat generation?
He fell in with Lucien Carr at Columbia, and Jack Kerouac had been a year ahead of him. Those three, with Burroughs, a kind of eminence grise, who was hugely well-read. Allen got more and more drawn into emulating the way they were writing, and Kerouac would mainly talk about beatitude, and then again about being beat in the gutter. And they fell in with lowlifes and hustlers and hoods, and so many, many senses of beat, and the usual one of the beat in music was considered part of it.
You haven't done it for me. You haven't really given me any impression of what people actually mean when they say the Beat and the Beat generation.
It was originally used by John Cleland Holmes. He simply was looking for a way of describing their generation in relation to the lost generation of the 20s and 30s. Cleland Holmes was talking about the lost generation, and Kerouac simply said, oh, well, we're the Beat generation. It was really just a very, very loose term, a bit like talking about the underground or the hippies or something. It could mean almost
60s,
anything.
yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
the swinging 60s.
Yeah.
I mean,
Perhaps it's a generation that can only be understood in the context of the age against which it was reacting. Give me, Miles, just some sense of the America into which the Beat generation burst.
I think this was a group of people who got together during the war. As far as they could see, you needed a new way of living. The consumer society, the set of values which had created ultimately the conditions which gave rise to the war, couldn't simply be just picked up again, which is why they, in a sense, set themselves apart from ordinary America, with the white picket fence. Because although they didn't write much about it, I mean, they were fully aware of the fact that there was tremendous segregation in the South, for instance, and they could relate to that.
But you say they didn't write much about segregation, and they didn't.
It's a surprising omission, really, but not too surprising in as much as this was very much initially a New York-based scene, and they hadn't travelled much. And certainly Allen had barely left New Jersey, and he was still very young at the beginning. I mean, he was still a teenager when he met these people, don't forget.
It became a wild scene, didn't it?
Kerouac and Ginsberg and Burroughs and Joan Vollmer were all living in the same apartment in New York, and I mean, Joan, for instance, she would read the papers in the bath every morning, and everyone would come in and discuss things with her, So, and in those days, in the 40s, I mean, this was pretty outrageous behaviour.
Very stimulating guys for somebody to develop from, and Allen learned from them and then wanted to impress them. One of Allen's big themes was candour, breaking through sham inhibitions that led to people covering up, lying to themselves. So he was kind of hysterical, and he wrote, "My poetry is angelical ravings and nothing to do with dull materialist vagaries about who should shoot whom."
A key moment for Ginsberg seems to have been a vision he had at his apartment in Harlem when he was 22. It lasted several days. Here he is describing the experience.
I was somewhat in an isolated situation, living by myself, eating vegetarian food, reading a lot of mystical writings. I had some sort of mystical experience, an experience of the divine, accompanied with an audition of Blake's voice, a very deep, earthen, ancient voice, the voice of the Ancient of Days, indicating that language, at its maximum intensity, maximum information, minimum number of syllables, maximum musicality, could effect on the nervous system some extraordinary catalytic change of perception. Voices of children are heard on the green, and whisperings are in the dale. The days of my youth rise fresh in my mind. My face turns green.
Allen Ginsberg,